The sun over Deadwood Flats burned like a forge left too long on fire. Heat waves rose from the hardpan earth, shimmering across the main street that cut through the little town like a scar. Wagons creaked, horses stamped and snorted, and men with dust-crusted hats leaned against railings, watching the day slide slow as tar. At the far end of town, just past the saloon with its peeling green shutters, a commotion was gathering. Folks spilled out of shops and leaned from balconies, their eyes drawn to the rough wooden frame erected in the square. A scaffold not for hanging this time, but for punishment. Sheriff Al B., a thick-shouldered man with a voice like gravel dragged over tin, stood before it. Beside him, 2 deputies uncoiled a whip, its leather gleaming black and mean under the noonday sun. The condemned man stood shirtless, his hands bound against the frame. His back was bare, already striped with old scars that told of battles past. His name was Ethan McGraw, a rancher by trade, gun hand by necessity and loner by habit. But he hadn't come to this place on account of cattle or cards. He stood there for a Lakota girl. The girl, her name was Anuka, barely more than 20, with long black hair braided tight and eyes dark as midnight rivers. She had been in town only 3 days, trading beadwork and herbs outside the mercantile. Most folks ignored her, some spat in her direction, and others muttered about savages, under their breath. But she kept her head high, proud in her silence. It was yesterday when trouble came calling. 3 drifters, white men with whiskey mouths and mean laughter, cornered her near the livery. They jeered, called her names, and one grabbed her wrist like she was no more than stock at auction. She fought him, fierce as a wildcat. That's when Ethan stepped in. He didn't know her name then. Didn't know anything about her, except that she was alone and outnumbered. But he knew enough. He'd seen men like those 3 before, men who believed cruelty was their right. Let her go, Ethan had said, voice even, hand near his Colt. They laughed, told him to mind his own. One swung. Ethan's fist found the man's jaw quicker than the sun finds dawn. The brawl was fast, ugly. When it was done, 2 men lay in the dust nursing bruises, the third had a broken arm, and Anuka stood free. But Deadwood Flats had its own rules. The drifters swore they were attacked unprovoked, claimed Ethan had near killed them over. Dirty squaw. Sheriff Al B., under pressure from the townsfolk who feared Indian reprisal, decided justice had to be swift, 30 lashes. Public Ethan hadn't begged, he hadn't explained. He only looked once at Anuka, who watched with wide, stricken eyes, and said, "Don't cry. I've had worse." The first lash, the crowd's murmur hushed when the whip cracked through the air. The first lash landed across Ethan's shoulders with a sound like tearing cloth. His muscles flinched, but he did not cry out. Blood welled quick in the welt's groove, trickling down his spine. Anuka stood at the edge of the crowd, her small hands clutched tight at her sides. Her people's ways did not allow her to interfere, at least not here, not now. But her eyes never left him. The second lash came. The third. By the 10th, Ethan's jaw was clenched so hard it looked carved from stone. The crowd shifted uneasily. Whippings were not rare in frontier towns, but few men bore them quiet. By the 20th, sweat and blood mixed, his back a map of crimson rivers. His breath came hard, but his voice stayed locked. By the 30th, the whip hung limp in the deputy's hand, and the silence of the square was heavy as a graveyard. Ethan sagged against the frame, his head bowed, but his knees did not buckle. "Nuff," Sheriff Al B. muttered, though it was more to himself than anyone else. They unbound Ethan, and he stumbled once before righting himself. He pulled his shirt on, though it stuck fast to his wounds, then turned, not to the sheriff, not to the crowd, but to Anuka. And though his face was pale and his body broken, his eyes burned like steel struck to flint. He tipped his hat to her. Then he walked into the saloon as if he hadn't just carried 30 lashes on his back. The saloon, the Green Shutters, was the only saloon in Deadwood Flats worth its rocket whiskey. Its floorboard sagged. Its piano was out of tune, and its mirror behind the bar was cracked right down the middle. But it was the heart of the town all the same. Ethan pushed through the batwing doors, every movement stiff. Heads turned, card games paused. Even the piano man let the last note hang. He went straight to the bar. Whiskey, he rasped. The barkeep, a nervous fellow named Henry Pike, poured without question. Ethan downed it in a swallow, hissed, then set the glass back hard enough to rattle. Outside, the crowd was dispersing, though voices lingered like smoke. Some called him fool, some called him brave, and some said he wouldn't live long enough to see the week through. Upstairs, behind thin curtains, Anuka watched him. Her lodging was nothing more than a small rented room, but from there she could see his broad shoulders hunched at the bar. Each lash mark had been carved into him for her sake. She whispered a prayer in Lakota, words meant for healing and for strength. The sheriff's warning later, when the saloon's lamps burned low and the air stank of spilled whiskey and sweat, Sheriff Al B. came through the doors. His spurs rang sharp against the floor. He found Ethan still at the bar, nursing his 3rd drink. "You should have left her be," the sheriff said, voice flat. "Would have saved you a back full of scars." Ethan didn't turn, and left her to those bastards. She ain't your concern. Ain't your people. Ethan finally looked at him, eyes hard. Ain't about people, Sheriff. It's about what's right. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed, adjusted his hat, and said, You won't see the end of this, McGraw. Injuns'll come for her, or the drifters will come for you. Either way, blood's gonna spill. Ethan didn't answer. But upstairs, Anuka heard every word. Nightfall, the prairie night was wide and endless, the sky a black sea scattered with stars. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voices rising thin and wild. Ethan lay on his bunk in the rented room above the livery, shirtless, back bandaged with strips of linen soaked in whiskey. Every breath was a fire. He thought of riding out at dawn. He'd done his part. No sense staying. But then he thought of her, Anuka, sitting alone in her room, her people gone, her enemies plenty. Sleep came slow, and when it did, it was broken by dreams of whips cracking, of dark eyes watching, and of the sound of drums far off in the hills. The next morning, Deadwood Flats woke early. Wagons rolled, shop doors opened, and the hammer of the blacksmith rang steady. But what caught every man's eye was not the sound of iron striking iron. It was the sight on the ridge beyond town. A line of riders, silent, stern, proud, Lakota. They rode down into Deadwood Flats like spirits conjured from the plains, their ponies painted, their spears and rifles gleaming in the rising sun. At their head rode a tall, broad-shouldered warrior with feathers braided through his hair and a gaze that could cut through stone. They stopped in the square. The townsfolk froze. Hands twitched near gun belts. The warrior raised his hand. "Wa come for the one who took the lashes," he said in deep, accented English. His voice carried like thunder. Ethan McGraw stepped out of the saloon, blood still stiff on his shirt. He squinted at the riders. The Lakota leader looked at him, then at Anuka, who stood trembling on the edge of the street. And then, to the shock of every soul in Deadwood Flats, he said, "You are a man of honor. For that, our law says you may have her hand if you will take her." The crowd gasped. A marriage pact. Ethan stared, stunned. Anuka's eyes found his, and the town held its breath. The square of Deadwood Flats had never been so silent. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath, tails swishing nervously in the heat. Ethan McGraw stood at the foot of the saloon steps, shirt still clinging to his bloodied back, and faced the Lakota riders. Dust swirled around their hooves, stirred by the weight of history pressing down on the moment. The leader, the one with feathers braided in his hair and scars lining his cheeks, dismounted. His boots hit the ground with the heavy finality of judgment. "I am Chasing Hawk," he said, "father of Anuka. Yesterday I heard the white men whipped you for her sake. Today I came to see with my own eyes the man who bore the lashes." His voice was not anger nor kindness. It was the voice of a man measuring another. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I didn't do it for reward, only to stop what was wrong." The Chasing Hawk studied him, then gave a slow nod. "Our law says when a man bleeds for a woman, his blood binds with hers. If he will take her, she is his wife. If he will not, she returns to us. But know this, rancher, your choice ties two worlds together, and both can break." The decision, the townsfolk whispered, eyes wide. A Lakota marriage pact in Deadwood Flats was like throwing a lit match in a hay barn. Nobody knew how long before it all went up in flames. Sheriff Albee stepped forward, voice sharp. "No, hold on. This is my town. We don't run by Indian law here." Chasing Hawk's gaze cut to him like a knife. "Your town whipped him. Your law drew blood. Now our law speaks." Ethan felt the weight of every eye, white and Lakota alike, pressing down on him. His back still burned from the whip, his ribs ached. But none of that weighed as heavy as Anuka's dark, steady gaze. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't begging. She was simply watching, waiting to see if he'd turn away. He cleared his throat. His voice came rough. "If she'll have me, then I'll have her." Jasps rippled through the square. Anuka's lips parted, and for the first time since he'd known her, her eyes softened. Chasing Hawk stepped closer, nodding once. "Then it is done. But know this, white man, she is not a prize to be won. She is my daughter. Break her and I will break you." Ethan gave a short nod. "Fair enough." But trouble brewing, the Lakota left at dusk, but not all was settled. The pact hung in the air of Deadwood Flats like smoke after gunfire. Some townsfolk muttered that Ethan was a traitor. Others said he'd invited war. The drifters, the same men he'd thrashed, snarled in corners of the saloon, nursing their wounds and plotting darker revenge. Sheriff Albee pulled Ethan aside that evening, his tone hard. "You've just signed yourself a death note," he said. "Those drifters ain't gonna take kindly to you marrying an Indian girl, and half the town's liable to think you've thrown in with the Lakota." Ethan lit a cigarette, the matchlight flickering across his bruised face. "Maybe I don't give a damn what half the town thinks." The sheriff shook his head. "Well, I do. And I can't protect you from what's coming." Ethan took a drag, exhaled slow. "Didn't ask you to." If the outlaws returned 3 nights later, the drifters returned. Not drunk this time, sober, mean, and armed. They came riding hard into Deadwood Flats just after sundown, their horses lathered, dust trailing behind like smoke from a fire. They tied off at the saloon and marched straight through the doors. The piano stopped mid-tune. Their leader, a wiry man with a scar across his jaw, pointed straight at Ethan. "You think you can shame us, then take a squaw for a wife like you're some kind of hero?" He spat. "Why say you're a coward hidin' behind savages? And we're fixin' to settle this proper tomorrow." High noon, Main Street. The saloon went dead quiet. A duel challenge. Ethan set his whiskey glass down and rose slow. His eyes were steady. "I'll be there." The night before that night, Ethan sat with Anuka under the wide prairie stars. The town was quiet, but tension hung thick in the air. "You don't have to fight," she said softly, her voice carrying the music of the plains. "You could ride with us. My father would take you in. My people would shelter you." Ethan shook his head. "If I run, they'll come after me after you. After your kin. A man can't outrun what's hunting him." She was silent for a moment. Then she reached out, her fingers brushing his bandaged hand. "Then I will stand with you." Ethan looked at her, and for the first time since his wife and son had died 5 winters past, he felt the stirrings of something he thought long buried hope. At high noon the sun blazed down, merciless and white-hot. The main street of Deadwood Flats was lined with townsfolk, pressed tight against wooden railings and porches. Children clung to their mothers, men shifted uneasily, hands near their own guns. The drifters stood at one end of the street, grim and ready. Their leader cracked his knuckles. Ethan stood at the other end, his Colt heavy on his hip. His back still throbbed from the lashes, but his stance was steady. Sheriff Albee stepped between them, raised his hand. "This here duel is by town law. Draw when the clock strikes 12. Fight clean, no interference." The clock tower bell began to toll. 1, 2. The crowd held its breath. 3. Ethan's hand twitched near his Colt. 4. Sweat rolled down his temple. 5. The drifters shifted, eyes narrowing. 6. The bell's echo rolled across the empty street. 7. Ethan's eyes locked on his enemies. 8. 9. 10. The leader's fingers curled around his revolver grip. 11. 12. The world snapped, guns roared. At the gunfight, Ethan's Colt cleared leather first. The shot cracked like thunder, slamming into the leader's chest, spinning him backwards into the dust. But the others fired too. Bullets ripped the air. One grazed Ethan's arm, another tore through his hat. He dove, rolled, came up firing. The second man dropped with a scream, clutching his gut. The third rushed forward, gun blazing wild. Ethan fired once, clean and sure. The man staggered, fell, and lay still. Silence. The street was filled with smoke and dust, the acrid stench of gunpowder burning the air. When it cleared, Ethan stood alone, revolver smoking in his hand. Where aftermath, the townsfolk whispered. Some looked at him with fear, others with awe. Sheriff Albee stepped forward, eyes hard. "You just bought yourself more enemies, McGraw." Those men had kin. Friends, folks who'll come looking for payback. Ethan holstered his Colt. "Then let him come." From the edge of the street, Anuka stepped forward. She took his hand, bold and unafraid, and the crowd parted like the sea. Chasing Hawk and his riders appeared once more at the ridge, watching silently. They had not interfered, but they had seen. The Lakota leader gave Ethan a single nod, the kind of man gives another when words are too small for respect. The new trail that night, Ethan and Anuka left Deadwood Flats together. Behind them, the town buzzed with rumors, fear, and grudges. Ahead, the open plains stretched wide, full of danger and promise alike. They rode side by side into the dying light, their shadows long against the prairie grass. Ethan knew the road wouldn't be easy. The frontier never was. But for the first time in years, he wasn't riding alone. And somewhere, in the rhythm of the horse hooves and the whisper of the wind, he heard the echo of a vow, one made not with words but with blood, fire, and 30 lashes. The end.